Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Giorlando. In today's video, we are going back to September 2007 and taking a look at one of my favorite decks at the time, Green Baboon Burn. It's really important when talking about this particular format to put exactly into context when this deck would have been playable. Because this deck is going to utilize Foolish Burial, it's going to be playable in the middle to later stages of the format, which means it's actually going to compete with the D-Rida decks that we see at the end of the format, and not as much the Perfect Circle decks that we see at the beginning of the format. For those of you who are unaware, Green Baboon was eventually errated. The way it worked eventually changed, but initially when Green Baboon was first printed, when any beast was sent to the graveyard, including as a result of battle, you could pay 1,000 life points to special summon it from the graveyard or from your hand, and ideally from the graveyard, making it very difficult for your opponent to actually deal enough damage because you're special summoning this really large monster that goes above the attack of all the monarchs at the time. As a result, for a long period of Yu-Gi-Oh's history, these Green Baboon strategies were playable. Unfortunately for Green Baboon fans, eventually the card was changed such that it was no longer applicable in the damage step and thus wouldn't trigger off Destroyed by Battle, and as a result, Green Baboon-based strategies went off to the side. However, at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, quite frankly, Green Baboon was at its peak in terms of playability. It saw a little bit of playability at the end of Troop Dupe, but it hadn't been out long enough for people to really focus in on a coherent and strong build. When the players really had an opportunity to work with Green Baboon, when there was really that emphasis on how to utilize the card, it would have been during the format that followed in September 2007, and this Green Baboon burn-based strategy is the most popular deck that utilizes Green Baboon during this time period. For those of you that play GOAT format, particularly the modernized version of GOAT format, you might be familiar with what's referred to as Panda Burn. Well, the Green Baboon deck that we're going to take a look at today is very reminiscent of that. We're talking about a deck that's going to incorporate Just Desserts, Secret Barrel, and Ojama Trio, really for two reasons. One, those cards all deal burn damage, or at least in the context of the first two, some form of burn damage, and Ojama Trio, which can contribute to burn damage. Then it's going to play cards like Desquala, which deals burn damage, Magic Cylinder, and Ceasefire. That's going to make up the burn package, plus Marshmallow, which technically inflicts burn damage. But because cards like Desquala exist, and more specifically Gaia Pander, both of which being beasts, this deck can inflict burn damage, and then utilize cards like Gaia Panda and Ojama Trio to synergize to deal even more damage, also being beasts at the same time, allowing you to incorporate a card like Green Baboon into your deck. So we're going to see a deck that's going to have a lot of burn-based strategy, a lot of beasts, and in addition to that, even cards like Cyber Dragon and Ryza. The deck that we're going to profile today is actually card for card the main deck, and at least 13 out of 15 cards out of the side deck of a deck that Dale Bolito used to top 8 a Toronto Regional all the way back in September of 2007, or at least during that format. Of course, this particular deck could not have been played directly in September, but within the context of that format. Which means this is a difficult deck to play against because in one sense you have to worry about the burn cards, right? You have to worry about your opponent building up this critical mass of Just Desserts and Secret Barrels, while at the same time you have to be wary about clogging your own field because Gaia Panda plus Ojama Trio can suddenly deal a bunch of damage, where at the same time you actually have to worry about the Ojama Trio OTK. If you're not familiar, back in the day, really at any point in time in which Ojama Trio was at more than one, if your opponent was able to clog your field with 5 Ojama tokens, it's very unlikely that you would actually have an out to that. A lot of decks during this time period simply did not have an out to having all 5 monster slots taken up by Ojama tokens, which meant that you did still need to apply some aggression, you still needed to try and beat your opponent quickly, but they also have that avenue as well. Plus, and this was not the case in every Baboon burn deck, but it is a decision that Dale made, which is to incorporate cards like Ryza and Cyber Dragon, which can actually punish really passive players who are trying to weed things out and play the game slowly, which means that this deck is going to attack on many different axes. It's going to hit you with the burn, it's going to hit you with the card advantage, with cards like Ryza, and then even Green Baboon, which is a bit of a card advantage engine in and of itself. Plus, in addition to all that, this deck gets to utilize cards like Level Limit Area B and Gravity Bind, which can be basic win conditions when combined with Gaia Pander, which makes it as a whole a very difficult deck to play against. And then you have to take into consideration the dynamics of playing against a card like Desquala. On the first turn you open Stratos, maybe you don't have Destiny Draw, and you have cards like Wing Blast. You want to set Wing Blast before attacking to a face down. That's somewhat logical. But do you set multiple cards because you don't want to take 16 or 2,000 points of burn damage? Well, now all of a sudden you might be setting back rows that are bluffs. I'm talking about a card like Soul Exchange, a card that you can't necessarily just activate, and now your opponent drops Ryza. There's a little bit of tension there, exactly what you should be trying to do. Should you be playing slowly? Should you be playing passively? Should you be setting more monsters on the field to play around Desquala? But now all of a sudden that plays into Just Desserts and Gaia Panda, and it plays into Ryza a little bit, but it also plays around Desquala. So there's this little bit of tension trying to figure out exactly what your opponent has and playing around it accordingly. And because this Baboon burn deck can attack on many different axes, it can be a really difficult deck to play against, and easily one of my favorite decks to play with. I really enjoy going back to play this format, and not playing D-Rida, which is likely probably the best deck. I really enjoy playing Baboon Burn because it just attacks on a different axis. But without further ado, we are going to take a deep dive look at Dale Bolito's top 8 Toronto regional deck list utilizing Baboon, Burn, and Gaia Panda. All right, first we'll start with what might seem like a bit of an unorthodox choice, but 3 copies of Ryza the Storm Monarch. Not everybody played Ryza the Storm Monarch in this particular deck. Sometimes you would see players elect to run cards like even Nimble Momonga, but I've actually found Ryza to be pretty good. Dale included 3 in the deck that I referenced in the introduction, and this happens to be one of the formats I enjoy playing. I carry around deck boxes of retro decks when I go to locals or other events, and I've actually had Dale's deck built now for years. And although it seems unorthodox on paper, if you at least keep the decks relative to the way they were at the end of 2007, I actually have found Ryza to be pretty good. Now, obviously, with modern knowledge, we might change these decks quite a bit, but relative to the format, I've actually found Ryza to be a pretty solid choice, all things considered. Now, this deck, things tend to slow down a bit. Your opponent might not even necessarily expect Ryza, and all of a sudden they've been taking all this burn damage, and now they have to deal with a pretty difficult monster. So I really like the 3 copies of Ryza. And this deck's not going to generate the card advantage that you might anticipate, right? You're playing a deck with just Desserts and Ryza. It seems like it's a little bit odd, some cognitive dissonance there, but I still think it's actually pretty good. So I think you'd be surprised with the 3 copies of Ryza. And then in addition to that, 2 copies of Cyber Dragon. Cyber Dragon is a bit of a beatdown card, so chipping away at some damage can be great once you then accumulate enough burn to win the game. Other than that, it is a good card, the combo with Ryza. Obviously, we're talking about a format right now where we're going to be attacking over spies and things like Stratos, Breaker, so there are a lot of attack position monsters that you want to attack over. You know, if you summon Cyber Dragon, attack over something, set Desquala, it's a little bit of tension there. What is your opponent exactly going to do, right? They have to have maybe their own Cyber Dragon, maybe they need to go Soul Exchange. I mean, they have outs to that, but now all of a sudden you're attacking on 2 axes, right? You're threatening burn, you're attacking over their monsters. It's really fits in really well in what this deck is trying to do. Then we have 3 copies of Desquala, which is one of the best burn outputs in this deck. It's also a level 3, so it combines really well with both Gravity Bind and Level Limit Area B when you happen to have that going. I know those are only at 1, but it does happen every now and again. In addition to that, they are beasts. And again, I alluded to it in the introduction. People call this Green Baboon burn. There's only 1 Green Baboon in the entire deck. However, as many beasts as possible, especially beasts that deal burn damage, are just absolutely critical. Then, in addition to the Desqualas for beasts, we have 3 copies of Giant Rat. We're going to have a little bit of a Giant Rat toolbox, I guess I'll call it, when we get to some of the additional monsters, but we have obviously Rat that can go into Rat, which is great, slows the game down. If you're trying to stall out a little bit, you're playing a burn deck, trying to accumulate some of those power traps, it can be fantastic in doing so. This is a point in time, again, I made this comment in the introduction, where you can just crash Rat and then special summon back Green Baboon, something that's no longer applicable. So enabling you to just always have that constant stream of monsters to bring back Green Baboon is just absolutely critical. This can also sometimes surprise your opponent by searching Gaia Panda. For those of you that play modern day GOAT format, you would know Panda Burn is a top tier deck, or at least a deck that you could conceivably play against. It might not necessarily be tier 1, but it has won some online events. It is one of the more frustrating decks to play against because this card synergizes so well with what this deck is trying to do with the traps, right? If you clog your opponent's field with a Drama Trio or an actual GOAT format with Scapegoats itself, something your opponent would have to do, this card just beats over them, deals a bunch of piercing damage. And this deck, because it's going to be playing just Desserts, a Drama Trio naturally, Secret Barrel, there can be turns where you burn your opponent for a bunch and then attack over the tokens, dealing 300 damage plus the piercing. And in addition to that, it's really easy to tutor this out with the 3 copies of Giant Rat. And it is also a beast monster, right? The more beasts that we can have, the more that's going to synergize with Green Baboon, making this one of the most threatening cards in the entire deck, right? The long game goal of this deck is to slow things down, clog up the field, because that both benefits just Desserts and Secret Barrel. But in addition to that, the Panda. So the Panda deals a ton of damage too, is plenty. Yeah, you don't really necessarily mind drawing it if the game goes long, but you can tutor it out with the Baboon, or rather with the Giant Rat. Next, we have a little bit of the toolbox I was talking about, which is Neospatian Grand Mole. It is unfortunately not a beast, although it kind of looks like one in the picture. It does, however, synergize really well with the Giant Rat. So we play 3 rats with that as an additional Earth monster to combine with the 2 pandas, giving us a relatively small but still reasonable Earth package. You could theoretically throw an Exiled Force in the deck. Some of these versions did. I have them in the side deck. That's what Dale elected to do. So I've elected just to make this the 6 Earth monsters you can tutor. Technically, you can tutor Morphing Jar, and you do have a Book of Moon in your deck, so it's not inconceivable that that would ever happen. But I guess that is an additional Earth target if you need it. Morphing Jar is really great in this deck because if you're playing a burn deck, and this has been the case throughout basically all of Yu-Gi-Oh's history, if you can just draw 5 cards and you're playing a burn deck, let's assume you've used a bunch of your first set of cards on burn damage, and now all of a sudden you draw 5 more. chances are you draw a bunch more burn, and then in theory you can just simply win the game because of that. So one Morphing Jar fits a lot of roles in this deck. We have a couple of the sort of stall cards, Marshmallow and Spirit Reaper. I think with modern Yu-Gi-Oh perspective, maybe we'd cut these, but if we're playing with Light and Darkness Dragon, they actually are really important. That's a decision point that a lot of people would have to make if they went back and played this format. If you want to play pre-Light and Darkness Dragon, I can understand not including these. Marshmallow, I guess, was released right around Light and Darkness Dragon, and there's no events in which Light and Darkness Dragon was legal and Marshmallow was not. So I guess theoretically, if you're going to play that, it makes a lot of sense. If you're playing without Light and Darkness Dragon, I honestly think you could cut both of these. The second you put Marshmallow in the deck, Light and Darkness Dragon is now legal, so theoretically you probably want to play both, which is what this deck list is trying to do. So both of these are important because neither of them are going to be destroyed by battle, and with Light and Darkness Dragon on the field, it negates activated effects, right? It will negate, the burn damage, it will negate a giant rat effect, but it won't negate the ability for your Spirit Reaper and Marshmallow to not be destroyed by battle. So against a card like Light and Darkness Dragon, it can be really important to stall the game out. So a couple stallers, we have Treeborn Frog, which might seem a little bit out of place. Not all these decks played Treeborn Frog, but with the Rises, Dale elected to play Treeborn Frog. All your back was are chainable, at least most of them. There are technically a couple continuous, but honestly, if you have Gravity Bind or Level Limit going, you're probably going to win anyway. Besides that, there's no Wave Motion Cannons, no Skill Drains, none of those traditional burn cards or stall cards. So Treeborn Frog, a little bit debatable again. If you were to think back of how to rebuild this deck, maybe you'd cut the Rises and the Treeborn Frog. I think they are pretty good though. From my experience, the game goes long, and Treeborn Frog just clogging the field has generally been pretty good for me, but you can kind of make that decision if you go back and play it. And then, of course, the very last card is Green Baboon. Green Baboon is, again, limited to 1, but it is at a point in time before its errata, which means it can revive itself after being destroyed by battle, or rather any of the other guys being destroyed by battle, not himself, but any of the other beasts being destroyed by battle. So it makes it really difficult to deal with in the long run, right? Your opponent can riser to the top of your deck, and you don't even necessarily mind that if you have a beast. Your opponent would have to have something like bottom, but that wasn't really played at the time. So this is pre-Caius. There's not a lot of ways to permanently deal with this because even if it's in the graveyard, it's threatening to come back. So 1 copy of Green Baboon. Going on to the spells, this actually has a relatively small spell lineup. Dale elected to play only 1 copy of Foolish Burial. That's a bit of a debate. There are multiple copies of Foolish Burial that you could play, right? You could play 2, even 3 copies of Foolish Burial. The reason you'd play Foolish is, 1, it sends Treeborn Frog, although not all these decks play Treeborn Frog. This particular version, you have that ability. You could just send Baboon itself, so it essentially acts as the second copy. You could bump this up to 2 or 3. Honestly, most builds had more than 1. They elected only to play 1, so that's why I'm profiling it with 1, but you could up this to 2 perhaps. That way, or even 3. That way you get Green Baboon more reliably. Honestly, from what I have found playing this deck, Green Baboon is a nice luxury, but although the deck has its name, Green Baboon Burn, you don't really need it to win. Oftentimes you play a lot with this deck and you just win with the trap card. So I think cutting back on the reliance on Green Baboon is probably the reason why Dale only elected to play 1 of these. And then maybe even included Treeborn Frog sort of as an offshoot there, where you might draw this without a beast, and sending Baboon doesn't really do anything. Obviously, you're not going to send a beast, so you end up sending Treeborn Frog to hedge against those hands. So 1 copy of Foolish Burial, 1 copy of Level Limit Area B, which is honestly, in some cases, a win condition with this deck, right? Shifting everything to defense and attacking over with Panda is just crazy. 1 copy of Book of Moon. It's a stall card. It protects you if your opponent obviously attacks. It also puts monsters in defense mode, which is great with cards like Panda. So there's that. It also gives you a backdoor out to skill drain, right? If you played back in the day, you would be probably really familiar with things like summoning a Monarch and activating Book of Moon while a skill drain is on the field in order to resolve the Monarch's effect. Well, you could theoretically get a Ryza effect off by Book of Mooning Ryza upon its summon, even if skill drain is on the field. So it gives you a backdoor avenue that way. We have the back row destruction. We have Heavy Storm, which might seem a little bit out of place, but again, we're only playing 2 continuous, 1 Level Limit Area B and 1 Gravity Bind. We also have Giant Trunade. Trunade is one of my favorite cards in this deck because you can set up a turn where you Giant Trunade and it bounces your Level Limit Area B. It bounces your Gravity Bind. It lets you set up for the turn. It lets you attack over things. It lets you use your Piercing now with Panda attacking over things that have been in defense because of Level Limit Area B. But then you also shifted maybe your Rises or your Cyber Dragons, and then you just reset all of them. It also, in addition to that, combos relatively well with Morphing Jar. I've had games that have gone really long period of time, and then you activate Giant Trunade, bounces all their back rows, flip Morphing Jar. They have to discard them all. There's also turns that you set up a Giant Trunade and your opponent might not anticipate it, so they've kind of been setting a lot after Heavy Storm's been gone. And it's just one of those cards your opponent might feel like they're more protected than they really are. And if the game goes long, it's nice having a singleton Giant Trunade in your deck because, having 1 bad card in your opening hand, you're not likely going to lose. That's sort of the benefit of playing a slower deck like this. And if the game goes 15, 20 turns, having a card like Giant Trinity is just one of those cards that warps the game, because in this deck with Level Limit, Gravity Bind, Morphing Jar, the games just go in a unique way, and it allows you to game plan for that long term and get Giant Trinity off in a way that's really advantageous. One Premature Burial, which I'm not going to say is out of place entirely, actually combines with Giant Trinity really well if you're familiar with that sort of old school combo. But, you know, with this deck, you can bring back Panda, which is great. You can bring back Arise if you need it. It can bring back a Giant Rat and Crash, which then can trigger a Baboon. So it has some application. We also have a copy of Hammershot. The reason why people played Hammershot in this format over other cards is that if your opponent has Illblood on the field, it's unlikely that a card like Smash and Ground is going to destroy it, because Illblood has really low defense. I actually have a copy of Illblood in my popular decks at the time pile. It only has 800 defense. And you actually want to kill Illblood when Illblood's on the field reviving, because when Illblood dies, all the zombies that it's revived also dies. So by playing a card like Hammershot with a 2100 attack of Illblood, it's way more likely that you'll actually be able to kill Illblood and therefore kill all of their monsters, which is way better than using Smash and Ground and killing, let's say, perhaps something like a Pyramid Turtle that this revived. Pyramid Turtle obviously has 1400 defense if you use just a card like Smash and Ground. So at this point in time, Hammershot was actually more popular than what you would otherwise have anticipated as a popular card like Smash and Ground if you wanted that kind of removal. I mean, it's only a one of, but it is a card that during this time period actually saw a reasonable amount of play. But this is our relatively small spell lineup. For our trap lineup, which is really the bread and butter of this deck, we have the 3 copies of Just Dessert, the 3 copies of Secret Barrel, and the 3 copies of Ojama Trio. So if you are familiar with GOAT format, you know that these are playable in sort of its own version of Panda before Green Baboon was released. And of course, if you're familiar with Chainburn, and you would be familiar with that if you have been watching my channel, you obviously know that these cards synergize really well with each other. Ojama Trio is actually really cool because there are very few outs to a 5 Ojama Trio field. And this deck, unlike, let's say, Chainburn, can actually achieve that relatively easily. If you open up with 2 Ojama Trios, it's not that difficult to play one, get all 3, attack over one, and then Ojama Trio your opponent out. If you look at some of the decks at this time, if you do not play into cards like Torrential, it's very, very difficult for a lot of decks to out that. In some cases, decks have almost no outs. So one of the things that you would find if you actually went back and played the decks from this time period, the way they were constructed, is that if you are wary of that, if you kind of know and game plan for it, you can Ojama Trio somebody and basically get a free win. I can't tell you how many times I've done that, where you can Ojama Trio, you summon Panda, you even summon a card like Grand Mole, and you attack or bounce the token and play another one of these, and your opponent's like, oh wow, that's bad. And I'm thinking, you know, you actually don't have any out this as long as I don't play into Torrential, because you have 5 monsters, you can't trigger your Torrential. I'm certainly not going to trigger your Torrential. You can't tribute them. It's not like you can summon a Monarch and spin it. Nothing like that, right? You can't tribute Monarch, Zaborg, your other Ojama Trio. That doesn't work. You can't Rise to try and spin one. So you can actually just lose the game because this is at 3, and it's pretty easy to actually kill the tokens in this deck. So fantastic. Dale elected to play 2 copies of Pulling the Rug. This is a relatively popular card in this format. It wasn't a staple, but if you weren't maining it, you were definitely siding it, and there was merit to maining it. Against my particular deck right here, it's not that great, but against Monarchs, it's great. Against Demise, it's actually fantastic because it hits all the Searchers. Against E-Hero or D-Hero decks, it's reasonable because it hits Stratos, and then usually they're subsequently going to hit the Monarchs in that deck. That deck, we're talking about decks like pre-Light and Darkness Dragon, Perfect Circle, after Light and Darkness Dragon, Derida, and it's good against both of those. Hits Breaker, which is actually a threat against this deck, right? Even if you're not playing against a full-blown Monarch deck, you can still worry about cards like Breaker. It also does hit the Monarch version of Macrocosmos decks, which is a pretty popular deck at the time. You're right, it's horrible against decks like Skill Drain Burn. It's not really great against the Mirror Match, unless they're playing Rises, so you easily side them out, but it has some application. A lot of people did play in this in the main deck. Macro decks typically play them in the main deck. It is a way of protecting your, I'm not going to call them floodgates, but your cards like Level Limit Area B and Gravity Bind. So double Pulling the Rug. And then just some 1-ups. We have a couple burn 1-ups, Ceasefire and Magic Cylinder. Ceasefire can deal a ton of damage in this deck, so it's a great inclusion. We have cards like Torrential Mirror Force, which are, you know, basically staples in any modern, rather any retro deck at this time. And then, of course, a Gravity Bind. Gravity Bind is basically a win condition. Same thing with Level Limit. We don't actually need an extra deck because we're not fusion summoning. This is before Synchros. You should obviously have one in order to at least bluff that you're playing a deck that could special summon from the extra deck, but you do not actually need one. In terms of the popular decks at the time, I've already commented on Zombie Master-based Illblood Card Safe Return Zombie. It's, of course, the Mirror Match. There's, of course, macro-based decks. We've profiled some of those. There's Skill Drain Burn we've profiled. There's a couple different D-Hero decks. There's Perfect Circle. There's the version with Light and Darkness Dragon if you're playing that far into the format. Of course, is a version of DDT that isn't overwhelmingly popular, but Chris Perovic was able to top with it at the beginning of the format in Washington, so I am going to include that. We have just typical Monarch decks. Of course, the Diffusion goes with that. We've got Gadget decks, which are pretty reasonable. And then, of course, we have Demise OTK. These are, to me, the top decks at the time. You might debate me on a few others, but for the most part, I think if you're going into an event, you're expecting to play against a lot of D-Hero-based Light and Darkness Dragon decks if you're going that far in the format. Maybe a little bit of the macro-based deck, certainly maybe one or two throughout Swiss, potentially a Baboon Burn deck, maybe an Illblood-based deck. So how are we counteracting this? So this is Dale's exact side deck. So I'm going to profile it. The archives on Old Duelist Ground coverage has only 13 cards, so I did throw a couple else in there. But I'm going to show you what Dale sided, and then I'll talk a little bit about what I might change. So Dale had 3 copies of Mobius. Mobius is great because it hits the macro-based strategies. Obviously, you can hit the skill drain-based strategies, so it has reasonable role there. It's good against decks like Gadgets, too, because they are going to have a lot of back row. So triple Mobius, triple Exiled Force. It synergizes really well with Giant Rat. I'm not sure I would actually maintain these in the side deck if I went back and played this. It's okay against cards like Spy, but honestly, if my opponent's clogging their own field with Spy and it's a slow-paced matchup, I'm not necessarily upset with that. But there are 3 copies of Illblood here. It is good against cards like Pyramid Turtle. It's okay, right? You can just instantly priority it at this point and kill their Illblood if you're worried about that. So it has some application in that matchup too. But again, this deck doesn't necessarily need to attack to win, so you could debate that maybe Exile Force could be replaced. 1 copy of Breaker, I think if you're not going to play it in the main deck, which you easily could with this deck, by the way, because it is sort of a beatdown burn deck, you could easily side deck it. There's plenty of matchups where it's good. 1 copy of MST and 1 copy of Twister. MST is at 1, and Spell and Trap Destruction is actually really good, right? You are worried about wave motion. Macro is not the absolute end of the world, but you do play cards like Giant Rat, so you don't really want it to stick on the field. So there is that there. In addition to that, we have... So Dale had 3 copies of Wabaku. I decided just to split that 2 Wabaku and 1 Threatening Roar, but 3 sort of battle stoppers so that when your opponent plays Advanced Ritual Art, you can chain one of these, or when they pay for Demise more specifically, you can chain one of these and actually survive the turn. A 3rd copy of Pulling the Rug. There's obviously plenty of Monarch decks. If the deck that you're playing against is hurt by this, Gadgets is another one I didn't mention earlier, well, then you absolutely just want 3. Right? Some people hedge and just put them in the main deck. If you're not going to main deck them, you need to have 3 somewhere because this card was just so good during this time period. And then this was actually the 13 that were posted on Duelist Grounds, going back to the old 2007 archives. The 2 cards that I decided to include because he's not main decking it is Dustshoot. If you're not going to main deck Dustshoot, and I can at least understand to a degree why, it is really good. It's almost like a 4th copy of sort of Wabaku Threatening War effects against a deck like Demise, which is actually even more the case with Mind Crush, right? Your opponent plays Advanced Ritual Light and you just Mind Crush Demise. And then they end up, usually just fizzling out their Advanced Ritual Art and passing the turn. So I have included these 2 as additional cards against a deck like Demise, which wasn't overwhelmingly popular, but was one of those decks that could sort of steal a win out of nowhere. But these were the 13 cards right here that Dale had in his original side deck. I've included these as sort of additional cards. I think Dustshoot's just a fantastic card anyway. Might even be worth maining. But nevertheless, that's Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Thank you for watching. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! content.